Hello and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the International Center for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicta and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our report at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. Please type any questions you may have in the questions box as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end of this webinar. The subject for today's webinar is biomass residues and their pre-treatment for use in power generation, presented by Professor Jenny Jones. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Benedicte. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so the report that we've been working on is based around agri-residues and how you can mobilise them for use mainly in power generation. And the report's being written by myself and two colleagues, Dr. Leilani Darvel and Dr. Bijal Gudka, and they're both online and they'll join at the end to help with questions if they're on call, if we need them. So the outline of my presentation is here. I'll just talk briefly about the advantages and disadvantages of agri-residues and why they're of interest. We'll look at the size of the sustainable global resource, briefly cover pre-treatment options and challenges, and also some of the challenges and risks with using agri-residues and how you can mitigate them. And finally, talk about the current status and prospects, and then wrap everything up with some concluding remarks. So first of all, why use residues? To add some context to this question, it's good to look at what's happened with the wood pellet supply over the last couple of decades. We've seen it increase from about 2 megatons in 2002 up to 46 megatons in 2022. And this has been This has prompted the development of global transportation of wood pellets in a large way. Europe is the largest market, as shown in the figure, and the Asian market is expanding very rapidly. North America is the biggest producer because Europe and Asia consume more than they produce, and so there's a global trade, particularly from North America to other parts of the world. Many countries now are looking at opportunities perhaps to use indigenous resources or to source cheaper resources that they can use mixed with wood pellets or instead of wood pellets. Normally it's mixed with wood pellets. And so there's a lot of interest now in diversifying away from just wood pellets to also using agri-residues to help meet this growing demand and help with energy supply security and things like that. So just a few definitions before I go on to the pros and cons of agricultural residues. They cover a really broad range of materials from things that are left in the fields after harvesting a food crop, straws and stalks, maybe prunings from orchards, stems and tops of some of the root vegetables after harvest, the root crops, and those are defined as primary residues. And then there's also residues that arise when these food materials are processed to produce products, food products, or industrial processing. And so bagasse and husks and shells and so on arise from the processing of the food. There are other types of agri-residues as well, such as manure and chicken litter and so on, but our report isn't considering those types. And in fact, this presentation only considers residues from growing food crops and from the processing of food, either for refining, for other food products, or for industrial processing. So what are the advantages and challenges of using agricultural and food processing residues. If we look first of all at the advantages, and I mean there's a whole talk on this slide really, so I'm going to go through it quite quickly, but obviously it's potentially a low-cost material that can contribute to countries' net zero strategies. So another avenue of mobilising biomass into the energy landscape. It has good carbon accounting credentials because these food residues arise from the growing of a crop that's already being grown, so there's no additional carbon accounting, if you like, in producing the residues, just from the development of the supply chain. So greenhouse gas reduction is another driver, and having some contribution to energy security. Also, if these are waste products, then obviously reducing waste is a really good advantage, and improving resource efficiency, promoting a circular economy with very low waste, especially if you can take some of the nutrients in those agricultural residues after you've used them for energy and put them back into the field. There's very good case studies around the world of using agricultural residues that have promoted really good sustainable development goals, such as rural development, job creation. Obviously, I've already talked about minimising waste, greenhouse gas reduction. A lot of countries, big agricultural countries, have this practice of open burning of residues in fields as well, places like India in particular, and that has led to problems with air quality. So that's another driver. You can improve some environmental hazards as a result of how you manage the agricultural residues. There's possibly a better public perception compared to wood pellets of using agri-residues for energy. It's seen as less contentious. And of course, now we have existing ISO standards for non-woody biomass pellets, which helps with trade. And also we have standards for thermally pre-treated non-woody biomass pellets, which I'll talk about later. So all those things are good things that can promote the development of the supply chain and the use of the agricultural residues for energy. However, there are challenges. Agricultural residues, of course, are very dispersed. You've got to collect them together. You've got to densify them in some way because they've got low energy content as well. They have high ash content generally and problematic ash components, high chlorine contents. They're seasonal fuels, so you may need, certainly you're going to need to produce a fuel that you can transport and store, and probably you need a boiler that can take a range of different fuels. So all these things under challenges point to the need for some sort of densification and pre-treatment prior to using these residues for energy. There also might be competing markets already for that resource, so that's an important consideration. If you start pulling resources away from one market, what fills that gap, and what are the greenhouse gas balances associated with filling that gap? So it's quite important to think about competing markets, not just from an economic point of view, but also from a greenhouse gas point of view. And obviously, if it needs a lot of densification, a lot of pre-treatment, and you may need to actually develop the supply chain completely, there's a lot of challenges around making that economic. So the highlight, I suppose, of this part is agricultural residues are actually widely viewed as an underutilised resource, and they can help to transition from fossil fuels, but there are challenges in their use. So how big is the resource? When we started to think about this question, we started to look at what crops are grown globally, and this slide shows the top 4 most important agricultural crops in the world and the quantities that were produced in 2022. So sugarcane is by far the largest agricultural crop produced globally, and in 2022 there's 1.92 gigatons of sugarcane produced. Maize comes in at second with 1.2 gigatons produced in 2022, and then rice and wheat both around 800 megatons per year. So if these are the top 4 important crops, then the residues from these 4 are going to be the top 4 important residues. There are others in the top 10 that are potentially also important for energy. Certainly oil palm fruit and the residues from the production of palm oil. There's also soya and sugar beet as in the top 10 of agricultural crops grown globally. So if we think about the residues that are produced from those crops, we can look at, for sugarcane, for example, the trash, that's the material that's left in the fields after it's harvested, which is approximately 340 kilograms per ton of sugarcane. And then after you process sugarcane to produce the sugar, the residue is the bagasse, and that's approximately 300 kilograms per ton. And then you get residues from maize as well, the corn stover and stalks, which again is the trash and residue that's left in the field after the cobs and the kernels are extracted from the cobs and the cobs are harvested. And then after the production of ethanol from maize, you get dried distillers grains, DDGS. So you can see that you get a large quantity of straw and stalks and stovers from the maize, and DDGS is another major residue. Similarly for wheat, which also can undergo fermentation, not just used for food production, you get a residue of DDGS from that, as well as the straw and the husks. I don't have the numbers for the husks, so that's why there's a gap there. And then we have rice. Again, you get 1.5 tons of rice straw per ton of rice, and 250 kilograms of husks approximately per ton of rice. And I've also put at the bottom the oil palm fruit and some of the residues that arise from processing the oil palm fruit to produce palm oil. Palm kernel shells is an important one that's already used quite widely for energy production. So this gives you the idea of the quantities. It gives you, if you like, the technical potential of how much residue there might be from these crops, but not all of that residue can be recovered sustainably. Some needs to stay in the field. That helps put carbon back into the soil, maintain soil health, also help prevent soil erosion, which is a big problem in some of the agricultural countries. So you get a sustainable recovered fraction, if you like, or the sustainable recovery factor, the SRF, that tells you how much you can sustainably remove from the field if we're talking about primary residues. Some of these residues are already used on the plant site for electricity or heat, or they're used in local projects already. So you then have to assess what the surplus is after you've looked at the sustainable recovery factor. And then you need to consider the logistics of developing a supply chain, and that would give you different scenarios depending upon the geographical location and how easy that was to do. So this brings us on to our global resource assessment, which is the size of the resource. And there's research out there that are trying to develop models for estimating the size of that resource under different scenarios. And the numbers that are produced can be quite different and quite a wide variation in the numbers. Depending upon your scenario, it'll depend on your sustainable recovery factor, which I should say depends on what country you're in and what region in what country. It might depend on land availability. It'll depend on what yields you've estimated and how those might change into the future. You might also have thought about population growth and diet and the need to supply to a growing population. So those are some of the things that are considered in these resource models. There's been a nice summary paper from the Supergen Bioenergy Hub that drew together a lot of this modelling work. And the key findings in that for 2030, which are mainly from the Committee on Climate Change, had a median value across different scenarios of 3,312 petajoules from agricultural residues, which is fairly small, but it's still significant. If you compare it with the same models for waste, the median value is 16,700 petajoules. But to 2050, there's been more models. So again, the Supergen Bioenergy Hub looked at 33 assessment models, and this is the data on the right there in the figure that they combined together. You can see that the different models give a really wide variation in the size of that resource in petajoules, but the mean value or the median value is 70,000 petajoules per year by 2050. I should stress that there is high uncertainty and variation in that forecast. But it looks like from what the research that's been done so far, the sustainable resource has an estimated median value of 70,000 petajoules per year. Once you've got the size of your resource, you then need to think, well, can I actually use it as a fuel? So in order to do that, you're going to need some form of densification and pretreatment. So the first densification process for the primary residues will be probably baling. This is an on-farm method, and you can produce bales in standard shapes and sizes with standard ideal moisture contents. And there's also, I should say, a midi big bale, which is the popular one in Denmark because it allows 3 layers of bales on trucks for transporting rather than 2. But these types of bales, they can be used in great boilers, and they have specially designed hand delivery and handling systems for the fuels, and they're burnt in specially designed boilers. But really, if you're using straw in bales, the transport distance for the bales to the site really dictates the scale of the plant. Above a certain size, it becomes uneconomic to transport straw from a wider area. So your next choice really in densification is briquetting or pelleting. And pelleting is really the fuel of choice for industrial use. And it becomes much more cost effective to transport densified agri-residues in this form. So there's a huge improvement in bulk density. As I've said earlier, there are ISO standards for standard sizes and classification for moisture and ash, to name a couple. But actually making pellets from agricultural residues is a bit of a challenge itself. When you make pellets from wood, the lignin within the wood acts as a natural binder to make a robust pellet, and the lignin content in most of these agricultural residues is lower than in wood. So you've no longer got this natural binder that helps form robust pellets. So durability and robustness of the pellet is still an area of research. You get surface cracks within the pellets, makes them less durable. So there is research going on in optimizing pellet production. This might include using blends, and there might be other reasons for doing this as well, to say reduce the ash content to meet the standard. So you might blend with wood, for example, co-pellet. You might use binding additives, or sometimes there's also research in looking at hydrophobic coatings to help fill in the surface cracks and keep the pellets a bit more robust. And really a large scale at the moment, as I said, these are the fuels of choice, but they're still really not used in dedicated large-scale units. They're used in co-firing, so either with wood pellets or with coal at large scale. So there are other things you can do besides just pelleting. If you want to improve energy density even further, then thermal pretreatment might be a pretreatment of choice. And I'm not going to go into too much detail around each individual one, but the three that are either commercial or near commercial are torrefaction, steam explosion, and hydrothermal carbonization. They all involve the action of heat within onto the residue, so that the solid that develops has a higher energy content, particularly after it's pelletized. And this figure on the right just illustrates how once you start to go to pellets and torrefied pellets, the volume that you're transporting is so much smaller for the same energy content. So that's one of the biggest reasons for doing it, really. So it gives you easier storage and handling and improved logistics. Another pretreatment that's of interest for agricultural residues is actually water washing, where you leach out some of the problematic components in the agri-residue. And particularly this can lower the ash content, which, as you'll see in a moment, can be very high, and remove some of the problematic elements, particularly chlorine and potassium, and I'll explain that in a moment. The other advantages you get if you torrefy the material, thermally pretreat material, is that material becomes much more easier to grind into small particle size, which you have to do to make a pellet. So there should be energy savings there from making the pellet, but you still have the same challenges in pellet making that you have for the non-thermally pretreated material. You still have the research going on in how to optimize the pellet making process. So not all these pretreatments are proven up the scale and are proven at scale, and really there's a bit of chicken and egg situation where there's not enough material around to be trialed large scale, and so there's not the demand for the material because we're kind of in that middle ground, trying to get this first of kind implementation right through the supply chain. But the ISO standard for thermally pretreated biomass is an important milestone. So yeah, sorry there's a lot of information on this table, but I will highlight the key ones. So this it's quite hard, as I've said, to get data on thermally pretreated agri-residues pelleted. So here I've just shown the data for wood, but these types of advantages are expected for agri-residues as well. So the last two columns show the ISO standards for thermally treated woody biomass and thermally treated non-woody biomass. And then on the first column is wood pellets, and then we've got 3 thermally treated wood pellet properties to compare with those. So I suppose the things to point out is that the ash requirements for the thermally treated non-woody biomass pellets are quite challenging. To get to less than or equal to 3.5 weight% ash, I'll show you some of the fuel properties in a moment, that's going to be challenging for most agricultural residues. So you may need to combine pretreatments to get your ash content down prior to pelleting. But so some of these pretreatments possibly decrease ash slightly, but some of them, like torrefaction, concentrates the ash in the fuel. So washing becomes an option for getting ash levels down. Heating value improves, bulk density improves substantially, and that's not an issue to meet this sort of standard, providing you can make robust pellets. You get some hydrophobic character to the pellets as well, so they can cope with some exposure to water, unlike wood pellets. And the biological degradation is slowed down, easier to mill, more homogeneous, lower transport costs. So those are some of the advantages. So pre-treatments improve physical and chemical properties of the agro-residues, but as I've hinted, you might need a combination to get your premium fuel that meets the standards. So, as I mentioned about high ash, this just compares now wheat straw, the range of values and the mean values from, I think, about maybe 20 or so different data sets for just wheat straw. These aren't pelleted. And then the next column, next to the wheat straw columns, shows you the ISO standard for non-woody pellets. So this is not thermally pre-treated. And then typical values for wood pellets. So you can see that the ISO standards for non-woody pellets are more generous for ash content than the thermally pre-treated standard. So you could potentially take your wheat straw, and if you can make robust pellets, you could probably meet this standard. Although some of these are going to be more challenging than others. Chlorine content, for example, can be very high in straws generally, and then the nature of the ash also can be problematic. So chlorine is going to be something that needs to be targeted. And then the nature of the ash. So most of the ash in straws is silica and potassium oxide. And potassium silicates are very low melting. So if you start to use this material in boilers, there's a chance your ash is going to become sticky and start to cause problems. So this presents risks in their use. So the bottom image on the left there is an example where ash has become sticky because of the temperature's high enough for it to start to melt, and you start to get these deposits building up on your boiler warms or on the superheated tubes, and that might sinter. So you might start to lose porosity and form very glassy material that's very hard to remove. If you're using this fuel in a fluidized bed, the softening of the particles, this is the middle figure, can start to stick your bed material together, so you can get agglomeration and even loss of fluidization in the bed. And then the other thing that can happen, because of the high potassium and high chlorine that's present in many of these primary residues, the potassium chloride becomes volatile and moves to the vapor phase. Then when it hits the cooler regions on the boiler tubes, it will condense and it'll form a layer there. And if that layer is sticky, it will start to collect fly ash particles. So you can get fouling on the tubes. And because you've got a chlorine concentration in that deposited material, you can get chlorine-induced corrosion. So these are the three biggest risks with using agri-residues. So there are ways of mitigating this risk. Dilution is a very common way of mitigating the risk. So you co-fire it with coal or with wood, so you have less of this in the system. It's less of an issue, and also you've got different ash material that changes the chemistry a bit. You can use additives, and aluminosilicates are favoured for capturing this potassium chloride and decreasing the chlorine-induced corrosion rates. You can think about choice of bed material for the fluid beds. There are corrosion-resistant alloys and coatings to help extend the lifetime of the boiler tubes. And in terms of plant operation, you might have to lower the tube metal temperatures, the steam temperatures, to decrease the corrosion rates. You might have to limit bed temperatures to prevent agglomeration. So obviously this affects your plant efficiency. But those are the main approaches, I suppose you have a choice of either dealing with the problem prior to the fuel arriving on site or dealing with the problem when it's on site, or a mix of the two. So status and prospects. So this is some data from a market research report that was published last year on the pellet market status. And we've got the wood pellet market size. This is in tonnes with year, and the wood pellets is plotted on the right-hand axis, and then the residues are plotted on the left-hand axis. So you can see the wood pellet market is, near over 40,000 or nearly 40,000 megatons, whereas the residues are much smaller than that in terms of the pellet market size. But this husk and straws are actually quite significant pellet contributors to the pellet market in terms of tonnage. And actually the total residues in the pellet market makes up 40% as a function of the total mass. The majority of those pellets are used for industrial purposes, which isn't surprising since it's dominated by wood pellets. So it makes sense that most of the material is used for industrial use. If we want to look at other residues besides those that are pelleted, because obviously the pellet market for residues isn't as developed as it is for wood, then one way we can do this is to look at the trade statistics. And the World Integrated Trade Statistics site allows you to track lots of commodity products that are traded all over the world. And this includes some of the agri-residues. And it gives a tonnage and a market value. So I haven't shown all the data, but some examples here. The USA is the largest exporter of wood pellets. In 2022, it exported 9 million tonnes with a value of $1.5 billion. Europe is the largest importer, but the EU is the largest exporter of cereal straw. And actually, it's also one of the largest importers. So there's a lot of straw being shipped around the EU, not just for energy use, but also animal feed, animal bedding, and so on. Other important markets were wheat residues and husks, bagasse and sugar beet residues, and palm residues. So these are already being traded. There were some surprises, at least surprises to me. The distillers' grains is a massive market, as are soya residues. So the USA is the largest exporter of the distillers' grains with 11 million tonnes in 2022 exported, so bigger than the wood pellet industry, and worth $3.4 billion to the US. And soya residues, even larger amounts, 23.8 megatons exported from Argentina in 2022, worth $11.4 billion US dollars, and probably a similar quantity from Brazil. It only had the market size in terms of value, which was $10 billion. So I suppose it's quite clear that this trade is already established. This just shows an example of the global trade in wheat straw in 2022. And yeah, it's clearly showing that it's quite complex, with some countries importing and then exporting, and it's a global resource, a global commodity. If we look at palm oil residues, you can see that Indonesia and Malaysia are obviously the two places where palm oil is grown in large amounts in the world, and it's exporting mainly in that geographical area of the world. And you can see New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and Japan actually uses a lot of palm kernel shells for power as well. So status and prospects. The EU leads the world in importing biomass for energy, but 2/3 of that is actually sourced within Europe itself. we've also seen that incentives for using agricultural residues work. If you look at Denmark, they've started incentivising straw use a couple of decades ago, sorry, and now use around 10% of their renewable energy is actually from straw, and they're probably world leaders in know-how of utilising straw for energy. We do have a UK bioenergy strategy. It's released last year. It's a little bit vague, but it talks about opportunities for agri-residues, possibly mainly in anaerobic digestion. But it's there as an interest for indigenous energy supply in the UK. Japan and South Korea are the second and third largest importers of biomass. Most of that is wood pellets, but also palm kernel shells, as I've said, is an important source. And then in Malaysia, they're promoting the increase in the use of biomass for power. So they've now got a national biomass action plan, which includes incentives for co-firing, particularly their palm oil residues. China has actually a capacity of 44 gigawatts of generation from agroforestry, so a mix of wood pellets and agricultural residues. They introduced feed-in tariffs, they have subsidies for plant construction costs, and they've introduced policies for straw management. So a lot of their rice straw and other straw from other agricultural products there's incentives to use those for energy, and there's less information around about how much is traded from China. So I think a lot of their residues is used indigenously. That's a word. In India mandated 5 to 7% biomass in co-firing in 2023. India has terrible environmental problems from open burning of crop residues in fields, and part of this mandate was to help improve those environmental problems, but also to decrease reliance on coal. But there is a very limited pellet supply of agricultural residues in India. So there's vast resources. There's a mandate to use those resources, but the two parts aren't really joined up very well. So competing markets, local logistic costs and environmental factors have to be considered by all these countries, and they are being considered for mobilising those resources. So international trade and markets are well established, not necessarily in pellets. Not all that material was pelleted, but there is a large trade already, a global trade. But using that for bioenergy is going to depend on a number of factors. And I've got my final slide. I talk about that in a little bit more detail. So just to conclude then, we've seen that there are a wide variation in estimates of how much agri-residues could supply to global energy. And we have to think about how much is sustainable to recover, what's the local infrastructure like, how much is already used locally, for example, in thinking about the size of that resource. But the median figure for 2030 was put at around 3,300 petajoules per year, and then a huge increase by 2050 to 70,000 petajoules per year. But the bottleneck in mobilising that resource is its dispersed nature, high moisture content, low calorific value, is perishable, so we have to densify it prior to use. A lot of mainly the secondary residues are already used for heat and power locally or traded and transported over longer distance. If you start to pull those residues into energy use, then you have to think about the counterfactual. So a lot of those residues are high protein, high cellulose, and they're going to animal feed. If you start taking them out of animal feed into energy, then what replaces them and what's the greenhouse gas balance associated with that? it's important that this fungible supply develops. That's a flexible supply, and the standards help with this, so that a pellet from one source is more or less equivalent to a pellet from another source, and you can start to have some security of supply, and users can start to get confidence that they can use these agricultural residues. Research into optimizing pellets from agricultural residues, or pre-treating to higher grade products and mitigating risk in using agricultural residues, that's really expanding rapidly. So there's a lot of research going on in that area. So, and I suppose the main take from the talk is agri-residues do have a small but significant role to play in future energy mix for many countries. But when thinking about exploiting a resource, first got to think about the energy policies and incentives for using that resource. That'll help you select the region and residue of interest. You then need to assess the technical potential of the resource. So what are the yields, how much residue is produced? You might have historic data to give you information on the stability of that supply chain. Then you have to consider the sustainable recovery factor, so how much you can actually take from the field to give you another estimate of the size of the resource. And that actually varies from country to country, region to region as well. Then think about what the domestic demand already or the use in other markets, and that gives you the surplus available. And then you think about, okay, how do I pre-treat? What's the existing logistical infrastructure like? How am I going to transport it? And then you need a full techno-economic and life cycle assessment to see if it's worthwhile mobilising that resource. And of course, that has to be complemented really by what the user wants. So resource characterisation, thinking about strategies for minimising risk, and all the economics and greenhouse gas are going to be dependent on that particular residue, that particular country. So it's very specific, resource specific, country specific. And I suppose the successful businesses of the future will be identifying the best residue, the best geographical location for exploitation, and to the best markets. And usually that's going to require a local densification prior to transport to some larger logistical hub. So you might have on-site densification transported to a central port or a central hub for further exploitation and further trade. So the untapped residue provides a unique opportunity for a sustainable resource, a sustainable bioenergy and circular bioeconomy. And as I've said, a likely large-scale model is that we have pre-processing plants near to the source and they serve a central hub. And thank you for your attention. Any questions? And sorry, I went a bit over. Okay, I'm going to open the questions up and see what we have. Okay, I'm going to invite Leilani and Bijal to join me. I think they can see the questions as well. I don't know if there's any, I'm just having a quick look through. Hello. Right, there's somebody from Indonesia. Is saying that co-firing in Indonesia has become a national program. They want to mix residues with wood pellets, and the questions are: are there any international parameters for using those? I think you were asking about the standards there. This is from Arief, and I hope that later in my talk that question was answered. Yes, there are standards similar to coal for non-woody biomass pellets, and the ISO standard, I don't know, Leilani, if you've got the number to hand, but yes, there are ISO standards for the pellets. The next question is, whether Indonesia would be able to export to Europe and the UK. I hope my talk has answered that question as well. I think you need to consider the entire supply chain. There's certainly a market for some of the secondary processing residues, for example, from palm oil, and I know palm kernel shell is a key one that many countries are already importing. And then the third question was around carbon capture. Best practice for carbon capture and co-firing. I think one place you can look at, and I don't know for the UK anyway, obviously we've been using wood pellets at Drax power station in the UK for a decade at least, and they use small amounts of agricultural residues there with the wood pellets, and they've just begun the consultation and have the nod, if you like, from government that they can go ahead with scoping their carbon capture onto those units. So I think if you want more information about carbon capture, Drax Power in the UK might be someone to talk to. We've also did a report 2 years ago on the status of biomass energy with carbon capture. So that will be freely available from the website now. You might want to look at that report. So I think the next question, perhaps Leilani, you'd like to field, which is around torrefaction. Which was Jeffrey Phillip. Saying 10 years ago, it looked like torrefaction was going to be really important because it addressed a lot of the drawbacks. Why did it not become popular? What's holding it back? I don't know, Leilani, if you'd like to comment on that.
I think you did mention the chicken and egg situation, didn't you? About, I think it has been proven to a certain extent, a lot of the claims, but it has been in short trials. So I think it's part of perhaps the industry not quite being completely convinced because there haven't been long enough trials, and also the production capabilities of the plants haven't been high enough to be able to assure that they can provide the quantities that they need. And so there's that also issue of to be able to be a large scale plants, large production plants, they need large investments, and it's very risky without a contract. So that's some of it. There have been some other plants that have, I think, failed because they don't know how to manage biomass, and they have had issues with actually producing pellets with consistent quality. That has been an issue before too. But I think things are looking up. There are quite a few plants on the pipeline at the moment. So we'll see what happens with those, but they tend to be based on woody biomass rather than agricultural residues.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions coming now. There's 3 from James Hewitt, which are quite tricky. One is, what size of power station would suppliers target? The capacity of woody biomass burning power stations greatly exceed 100 megawatts in Europe. These are going to be uneconomic without subsidy. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking at a dedicated agricultural residue plant, as I've hinted, that's really limited in scale. I think most of the ones that are around that are just using agricultural residue are less than 50 megawatt, maybe less than 40 megawatt. I don't know if my colleagues can help out there. So for a dedicated plant, you wouldn't be looking at large scale, but if you're looking at agroforestry, where you're using woody pellets and agricultural pellets, then they could be larger plant, and that's the route that some of the new builds in China and in Japan have gone down that route. And it also helps with fuel supply because it gives you a bit more flexibility in the fuel supply you can take because of the seasonality of some of the residues. I hope that helps. Now, there's a question about costs as well from James. And I'm afraid I can't answer that. I've hunted for information on costs. And obviously you're adding cost to the residue for each pre-treatment step. So yeah, I've struggled to find data on costs. So I don't think I can answer that question, James. The CO2 emission, are the CO2 emissions of the energy required for the thermal and other pre-treating large relative to other components of the supply chain? Yeah, I think this depends on the supply chain. So if you did have, if it wasn't natural drying of the fuel and you did have, you know, a heat requirement for drying, the heat requirement, say for torrefaction, isn't much more than that heat requirement for drying. The drying is the biggest penalty of this step. But obviously it would depend on your supply chain and whether there was other means of drying your fuel. I think I don't know if you came across anything, Leilani, but I think that's the main thing I can say really about the thermal pre-treatment. There are added penalties, and this is why I think the next big research area has got to be these techno-economic assessments that start to bring all this on board. Because the other thing is, yeah, you might have a added CO2 penalty on the production of a really premium pellet, but then every transport step for that pellet, you're saving CO2 because, you know, every bucket crane or whatever, however you're shifting the material around, it's carrying more energy. So I think that's why the techno-economics becomes so useful, because you can look at CO2 penalties, but also CO2 savings at other parts of the supply chain. Leilani Bijel, if you wanted to pick any of the other questions up, please go ahead. We've got one that hits the nail on the head, really. It says, what will the technical challenges be for rice husk pellet and rice straw utilisation in developing countries when there's no biomass data, poor harvesting practice, poor logistics, and poor mechanisation infrastructure? I'm guessing that it hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? I mean, you've already identified the technical challenges in your question, I think. But rice husk is slightly different to rice straw, though, isn't it? Because rice husk is already a centralised place. It's produced at the mills. So rice husk pellets are already in the supply chain. But rice straw faces all these other issues that you mentioned. And it's very country specific and even regionally specific. Within, say, China, there's going to be regions in China where it's more cost effective to collect the straw than other regions. Maybe labour costs are lower, or erosion isn't so much of a problem, so you don't need to leave as much in the fields. There's more you can collect. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really answer your question, but I hope I've given you some food for thought. It's a question here I haven't really thought about. I'll just read the question out. I don't think I can answer it today, but it's an interesting question. There are often importing restrictions concerning various biomass types and agricultural products due to the risk of diseases spreading or the risk of transferring non-native species to a new country. Do you believe these restrictions might have a big influence on international trade of the products in the future? And if so, what could be done to solve the issue? I suppose my off the top of the head response would be, if you've already put them through the pelleting process, they've already experienced steam temperatures, they've already been heated. So I suspect it's a much lower risk for pellets. But it's an interesting question and something I will look into. Thank you for that. There's a question about coatings for chlorine and sulfur mitigating corrosion. I don't have that data to hand. I could follow that up with email. This is a question about what coatings you might use to mitigate chlorine and sulfur induced corrosion. I think if you can email me, I'll follow that one up. I think that's most of the questions.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Very interesting. And I think that's all we have time for today. All that's left for me to say is the slides from this webinar will be available to download from our webinar page shortly. And the report should be out next month, I believe. And the next webinar from us will be on the 13th of March and will be presented by Greg Kelsall. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.
Okay, thank you.